regions and the planetary. This is part of today's journey that actually started in Melbourne in the morning, looking at all life, human, more than human, perhaps even machine life, which is enmeshed and part of shared systems. It continued in India and UK time zones, looking at the question of a new internationalism. How do we govern in a world where the most pressing challenges, resource conflicts, planetary scale, infrastructure, ecological crisis transcend the very borders and institutions that are meant to contain them? And it leads further to us looking beyond the national, looking into cities, bioregions, and the planetary in a moment where our world is rapidly evolving, where the traditional boundaries and notions of separation are being appended about by a profound re-entanglement of everything. And imagine a city like Berlin, where I'm based here, or Nairobi, where Amolo is calling in from, not merely as an isolated urban center, but as a vibrant node of a planetary network. So each street, building, even the chair that you're sitting on is interwoven in these global cycles. And it's this re-entanglement that is challenging our old paradigm of divisibility, the idea that things can actually be neatly compartmentalized into independent units. It also invites us to embrace a more holistic planetary perspective. And with planetary civics, we ask at its heart, how do we govern, relate a world where every element, from a piece of cloth that you're wearing to an entire city, partakes actually in this expansive, interconnected cycle, is part of metabolic flows that shape our day-to-day, and flows through us like the water we're drinking or the food we're eating. So I'm calling in from Berlin. Politics for Tomorrow is based in Berlin. We have experienced many sleepless nights following the announcement of the re-election before the end of last year. And after this weekend, this political moment compels us to reconsider our approaches and the communications in the face of a shifting national, but also international and planetary dynamic. So only a few voices and narratives can truly engage with the complexity and the necessary shift of our times. And for us and our work, it's actually imperative to communicate these ideas and their planetary implications. So I bring you a quote from Bayo Akomola's Inside, while Friedrich Merz over here pushes for distinct NATO doubting European independence. And possibly also a kind of decline of a Westphalian order. And amid these dramatic upheavals, the enduring logic of modern governance quietly tries to maintain the Anthropocene. And Bayo points out that the pendulum swings once again, but the pendulum doesn't threaten the clock right now. It still keeps ticking. If other futures beyond the already colonized future are to thrive, then we will have to think out of time. And I think this is also something that Rosie Braidotti invited us to do this morning. And we want to add that also this needs a new type of politics, a politics that is more entangled, a politics that can actually speak and describe this complexity. So this quote for us underscores the seismic shifts that political alliances and structures, highlighting that while traditional politics may actually be faltering, so we need to find a new way of address the transformation of sovereignty. And we have learned throughout the last years and also throughout the events of today that the state as a central authority delegating power to individuals through representation works only to a certain extent. And also the idea of sovereignty and political representation, so the two pillars of modern democracies, often clash, then align with each other. And this is bringing our work that we have been investing into in terms of democratic innovation to the question of how can we actually contribute to changing the system rather than actually supporting the status quo, because we know that citizen dissatisfaction actually drives the kind of renewal of democracy right now. And it's not actually a structural rethinking of what is necessary, but rather a kind of curation of symptoms that we see popping up every single day. And the limits of national frameworks to us is very apparent. So we already know that only few nation states are actually sovereign or follow the idea of a kind of complete sovereignty. They also fail to fulfill social contracts that have been promised, but that create a kind of distrust in what we call government. And it also imposes a kind of gap between the stated sovereign rights and a real world violation of theirs. So what we invite you to look at is a kind of shifting relations between and within this entangled world, within these kind of interconnected polycrises, and also understand that there is an explosion of agency. So the state no longer is the sole holder of sovereignty, but we have many other institutions, many other agents that are actually part of a new construct. And we want to point out that the kind of inherited concepts of sovereignty seem inadequate amid these overlapping publics and amid these, let's say, new emerging institutions, but also entanglements between human, machine, so-called nature, so-called institutions. And understanding that this is not only a threat, but actually a call and invitation to reframing the national, to actually understand and acknowledge that the national boundaries can't stay the main gateway for our collective action, is opening up new growing systems where we can actually learn together, and where also cities can become signal points, where we swiftly can respond to urgent local realities, but also on a larger scale can influence planetary agendas. We will also look at bioregions today as a kind of more holistic lens, connecting our social, cultural embedding in the ecological context that we're living in. And we want to shift our gaze from the interplay between the very micro, what is happening in front of our door, with and towards the macro, towards the planetary, reminding us that we are actually nomadic mammals, that we are rooted in specific habitats and yet woven into planetary processes. And as we navigate this new era, I think the challenge becomes one of holding the vast amounts of plurality together. As pointed out this morning in the Melbourne event, we need a new intellectual language that actually bridges these big distances between micro, macro, meso, all of the levels and all of the dimensions that you can imagine. We want to invite you actually with Planetary Civics to be part of creating that language, and not only the language, but also the action, to new innovative civic practices that are rooted in knowledge that we actually forgot, but also that make use of technologies and generate new knowledge that honors the autonomy of an individual entity, but also the undeniable truth that all are connected in a web of planetary interdependencies. And by looking at that and posing questions from bioregions, cities, becoming meaningful actors, looking at the institutional scale of that, but also understand how do we connect our decision-making to this kind of new scale, we actually want to create a kind of urgency, but also gentle action around this understanding that we live in the consequences of geopolitical misalignment, that there is an invitation and a possibility space right now in the next 10 times 100 days to rethink governance beyond borders, and that each and one of us is actually invited to partake in that shaping and is part of, has a possibility to creating new civic frameworks, not only in one city, in one country or one continent, but we invite you to do that together across continents and across a kind of bioregional, embedded, still localized approach that allows us to connect with something bigger. So it's my big pleasure and a real honor to actually introduce some dear colleagues of mine and experts that have been dedicating their work since many years to understanding these interconnections. And we have lined up 3 extremely relevant experts giving us an idea, first of all, about the bioregional framing and the challenges and the opportunities that come with that. Leon Seefeld from Dagmata Labs will do that. Then looking into civic metabolisms, but from an African perspective, Amolo Ambole from Nairobi University and Open Cities Lab will take us there. And then, let's say, rounding this up with an idea and a long-standing work on urban ecology and with a European approach from Salvador Rueda, who will actually take us into some principles of how to make cities or turn cities into centers for innovative and civic action. After these 3 short inputs, we will have time to discuss with the speakers. You can actually scan the code or follow the link in the chat, and you can leave your questions on a board where you can see each other's questions, where you can also vote up or down, and where we can then, for the discussion, have a little bit more of a structured way of understanding how to prioritize. So thank you very much. It's my very pleasure to hand over to Leon Seefeld. Leon, you have been deeply ingrained in work at the intersection of finance, nature, systems thinking, but also novel business models. You have been deeply busy with designing regenerative financial value flows, but also systems that actually create conditions for different financing models. And the bioregional approach has been long part of your work for actually localizing this very, I would say, institutional or conceptual work into with the earth, with the ground. And it's really a pleasure that you are actually opening up this lens for us and this perspective. Great to have you here, Leon Seefeld from Dagmata Labs.
Well, thank you, Caroline. It's such a pleasure to be part of this. What an event, what an inquiry, and a privilege to contribute a small part talking about bioregions, what they are and what opportunities and challenges there might be. I thought I'd kick us off with, maybe creating some shared ground, shared understanding of what a bioregion actually is. And I brought a couple of definitions here. I appreciate it's quite a bit of text, but maybe there are a few people who want to take screenshots and read later. I'll go through it in decent pace, so we'll get the same understanding. There's one that I particularly like from Planet Drum Foundation. All of the definitions that I have here are really from the pioneers of bioregioning work in the 60s and 70s and 80s of the last century. And The Planet Drum Foundation was one of those early pioneers, defining a bioregion as a geographical area with coherent and interconnected plant and animal communities and other natural characteristics, often defined by a watershed, plus the cultural values that humans have developed for living in harmony with these natural systems. And because it is a cultural idea, the description of a specific bioregion uses information both from the natural sciences and other sources, and each bioregion is a whole life place with unique requirements for human inhabitation so that it will not be disrupted or injured, the bioregion, and explicitly also saying that people are counted as an integral aspect of a place's life. There's another definition that I've brought where I just want to, highlight that also this definition really speaks to the combination of the natural and the human perspective, incorporating the natural sciences from climatology, physiography, and animal and plant geography. But it also explicitly says that the final boundaries of a bioregion are probably best defined by the people who lived there and who have, through the human recognition of the realities of that place, really understood what the place is and how to draw the boundaries. And what is interesting about what Peter Berg says here is that a bioregion has, according to him, a very distinct resonance among all living beings, living things in that particular place that is distinct from other places across the world, and other bioregions. So it's also something that, we're feeling. It's not something that is so rigid. And I think the next definition, the last one that I brought, also highlights this non-rigidity quite a bit, saying that it's a fluid thing. There's flexibility in how we define bioregions, depending on the flora and the fauna and everything that, as I just said about the natural and the cultural. But it's also this sense of, at least for the human beings, it's a sense of belonging and coming home to a place and the land. And it's about deeply being rooted in that place. So maybe to summarize in the next slide, I've just pulled out the key things again. It's really this combination of coherent ecosystems and other geo and earth systems that make up a bioregion in combination with coherent cultural values and how humans have adapted to the life in that particular place and have created harmony in living with these natural systems. So a bioregion is a whole life place. Bio is obviously, from the Greek word life, and it has this very distinct resonance, this relational aspect to it, this sense of belonging. Some people say there are different ways of defining bioregions, and they usually have these hard, soft, and human lines, which speak to geological, ecological, the life lines and the cultural lines. And I think it's important to also say that contrary to how in politics we often define borders and boundaries in jurisdictional terms, bioregions can actually overlap. It has a lot of, it borrows a lot of wisdom from indigenous ways of organizing land and belonging. And these bioregions can therefore overlap and can also be fractally nested. So there can be a bioregion that is part of a larger bioregion, and so on and so forth. And I have brought a couple of examples just to say that, this is not some fringe, strange idea that some people who maybe lean more towards wokeism have, but it's actually happening across the world, and people are doing it across cultures. So the left one that you see here is up in Scotland. There's another one right next to it across the border of the US and Canada in Cascadia, quite well-known bioregional organizing effort. Then there's another one in Latin America that really stretches across the borders of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, and unites more than 30 different tribes living in that space of the Amazon Delta, or the Amazon watershed, and uniting them around the restoration of that place, and then all the way through to the right-hand side to New Zealand, where people in the Golden Bay or Mahua bioregion are organizing to regenerate that bay, that place. I want to speak a bit about opportunities and challenges, and I think this really in light of what Carolyn shared, in the introduction, saying that the planetary crisis that we all live through really demand governance that reflects the reality, of the ecological and the social side of things, rather than being dictated by political borders. And there's this beautiful expression of the polycrisis has a face in your bioregion. You can experience the polycrisis in all of its dimensions in and across a bioregion. And so there's this opportunity to organize bioregionally and to therefore also mirror the structure of the crisis in our response. There's something about scale linking, where we can, the places of belonging, where in urban areas where people identify with neighborhoods in their city, need to match up or need to link somehow to the global, defined by nature, the global interconnected system of continents and the planetary. And the missing middle here is the bioregion, is the scale that can replace the nation state as a function that has really failed at addressing a lot of these issues, and can do that scale linking. Bioregioning invites us to not look at individual ownership of assets or individual responsibilities, but actually the shared assets and the shared risks that we're facing across landscapes. The Amazon that I mentioned, but also the Alps and other places that I'm sure we're talking about here in this inquiry, are already facing transboundary collapse. And so it is about sharing that and addressing that together and increasing resilience together and increasing the carrying capacity of the places that we live in through human interaction. It's not about just letting go of all of that control. It is about actively being involved and being stewards of this. There's another beautiful element of bioregioning that really tries to address things at the system level. So when we talk about food systems or food sheds or watersheds, other fiber sheds, material sheds, the bioregion is a place where all of that can be coordinated rather than in fragmented projects of NGOs and like governments in their silos here and there doing some interventions. If we take a whole bioregional approach, we can tackle these problems at the system level. And we do that in a very place-specific, context-specific way, because that is so inherent to the idea of bioregioning. And part of this human cultural element in it is too that people find belonging in place. And in face of these crises and the adversity, I think that there's meaning to be found in regenerating the place that you live in. And I think that really transcends beyond political divides. I think people, whether left or right, everyone cares about their own place. And reimagining what it means to be a citizen of that place, I think, is the huge invitation of bioregioning here. There are obviously lots of challenges with this approach too. In the work that we're doing, we're experiencing that resourcing is not enough. We need to work on new ways of financing this work, but not just financing, also other types of resources need to flow into bioregioning work. We need expertise. Investment bankers are crowded in New York, London, and Frankfurt and Tokyo, but not in our bioregions, are not structuring the financial instruments and institutions for our bioregions to be resourced, and that is equivalent across all the types of expertise, not just financial. This jurisdictional aspect is interesting because, while it is an opportunity to work across boundaries and borders, it is also obviously, it comes with complexity to work across legal systems, right? If you work across borders, then you have to work with different legal systems just as one example, and different responsibilities of parts of government, for example. So it can also be a complexity to deal with, but it's a huge limitation. There's a threat or there's a risk that this is perceived as a threat by incumbent power positions. And I'll speak about that in a second for a bit, because I think there's beautiful ways to circumvent that. And I think we really have to be careful not to use too much language and build this up in a way that it can just be attacked as a new vogue thing or a new esoteric thing that the left green are interested in, but really that unites across the political divides, as I said. So it's really a fine line to walk, but there's huge opportunity here. On the next slide, I try to give a bit of an outlook on what is already happening and what might be happening. And I was talking about the risk of bioregioning being perceived as a threat to incumbent power. And I think what I'm seeing and hearing in the conversations with people who are leading this work on the ground is that start with those things that are no-brainers, right? Like organizing water management by watershed totally makes sense. Like, I don't think anyone can argue with the fact that we need to work with water management across the whole shed of the water, because what happens upstream totally impacts what's happening downstream. And so things like, the Alliance for the River Danube, which really crosses a lot of countries across Europe, are examples of this, like transnational partnerships that work across these naturally defined features and assets is something that we can do. Bioregional organizing teams, I've already mentioned the Amazon, where like 30 different tribes are coming together to organize bioregionally and just to exchange with one another, right? Like there's no parliament suddenly set up or something like that. It's really just a team of people coming together trying to organize the work around the restoration together. So that's possible. The alternative education ways of education and getting to know the place. So we see bioregional hubs and learning centers pop up across the world, where people start to say, come here and learn with us about what it means to live bioregionally and to be stewards of bioregions. And then we can move all the way through to like those risk alliances where, corporates come together and say, we all face the same flooding risk of this river. What would happen if we all organize bioregionally in order to address these risks? And then obviously the thing that I'm particularly passionate about these days is the bioregional financing facilities, to really reimagine financing institutions at the hyper-local bioregional scale and organizing financial flows in favor of and in support of the regeneration work that is going on. I think what is interesting to say is as well that some of these incumbent power positions of the EU, the UN, wealth holders, corporates, all of that are already interested in this. Certainly myself, but I guess everyone who's working in this is experiencing a huge interest in this and a willingness to engage and a willingness to make this happen. So I think we're a really interesting moment in time where this sense of opportunity hasn't been bigger before, I think. And I guess I'll close by saying that it's always most interesting where these new ideas interface with the old systems or the current ways of governing that we have. And obviously every bioregion will have cities in its territory, right? There will be urban settlements, and maybe that is a good segue to the next little input that we're receiving. But I'll hand it back to Caroline to lead us there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leon. This was really an amazing setting the scene for landing us, really rooting us in a place, in the soil, in the earth, in the planet. And now you already said it, each bioregion or most of them have actually cities as part of their metabolisms and also as part of their entanglements. And it's my real pleasure to introduce now Amolo Mbole. Amolo, we met in Alpbach last year. You're in development, you're an innovation expert, and I'm a real fan of your work. You work with top African universities, including the University of Nairobi, but also with civil society organizations like the Open Cities Lab. You're leading strategic partnership, and it's my real pleasure actually to tap into your expertise and your perspective concerning the civic metabolisms that we're dealing with, but also connecting that back to the planetary and to a regional approach. Over to you. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Caroline. It's such a pleasure for me to engage in this very important conversation from Nairobi. You've introduced me very well, so I'll go right ahead and start talking about Nairobi itself, which, as you can see, is there in the background. Maybe if we look at that picture for a while, this is the national park of Nairobi. It's very central, and at the back you can see the skyscrapers. So very interestingly, we've set apart about 16% of the city for this park. And I would say that that is a success worth celebrating. Of course, Nairobi has many other challenges, which I'm going to be discussing today. And I'd love to use it as an example, as a microcosm of what's happening at the planetary level. Thank you. So if we move on to this slide, I have here a Swahili saying. Swahili is one of the many languages that we speak in Nairobi. And one of the common phrases we have is Nairobi si ya nyanya yako, which is a derogatory but popular term, which means Nairobi is not your grandmother's city. And what that refers to is that this city is a ruthless place. It owes you nothing. You must fight for your place in it. You don't belong here. You will return to your rural home, the land of your ancestors. I'll give the example of my grandfather, who arrived in Nairobi in the 1940s, and he knew from day one that Nairobi was not his home. So he did not treat it as his home because he knew that eventually he will return to his rural home in Ugenya, around the lake, which is where his ancestors are buried. So that sense that Nairobi is not your home has been passed down even to me, even though I would say now a second or third generation city dweller. So what I'd like to do for today is to flip that script and think of Nairobi as our home. And with that, I'm proposing this new phrase, Nairobi ni ya nyanya yako, which means that Nairobi is your grandmother's city. The city becomes that sacred place, for it gives us life. And it carries our stories for generations to come. This is the legacy we're going to leave our children and their children's children. So we have to start thinking, what is that legacy going to look like? Is it going to be a legacy of transformation? As we move on, thinking about the city of Nairobi as a metabolic living organism, then I'd like to start thinking not just of urban citizenship, but urban ancestorship. In 50 years or 100 years to come, we will be the ancestors of these cities. And as I've said, do we want to be remembered for having left a legacy of transformation? The Mogumo tree is a sacred tree for the Kikuyu people who live in the central part of Kenya, or rather they come from the central part of Kenya, but now, like everybody else, they live in different parts of the country. And recently, this was last year, I believe it was last year, yeah, about a year or two ago, a Mogumo tree was going to be cut down in the middle of one of the main streets because the road needed to be expanded. And there was a lot of activism around ensuring that this tree is not cut. So as far as I know, this tree still exists because it's a sacred tree and it's over 100 years old. The Kikuyu went under this tree to pray. And now in the last photos I was looking at of this Mugumo tree, there are school children coming around this tree to think about what urban ancestorship looks like. They might not call it that, but really that's what we are thinking about when we think of a Mugumo tree right in the middle of Nairobi. So for us, this city is a complex entanglement of challenges and possibilities. There is so much innovation happening in Nairobi, and everyone I talk to who comes to this city usually doesn't want to leave. They're like, this is so amazing, people doing great things here. But there's also a lot of challenges, such as exclusion. As someone who recently acquired a disability, I'm now very cognizant of how our city is planned for exclusion. And that comes probably from our history. The first master plan we had of Nairobi in 1948, if we go back, sorry. The last master plan we had of Nairobi in 1948 was colonial, and it was supposed to separate the city for our colonial masters and for people like my grandfather, they were supposed to come to work in the city and then go back to their villages. So that exclusion exists even today, even though we've now had 2 other master plans of the city. And this is the story of many African cities that are colonial. I think there are just about 2 or 3 capital cities that are not colonial or that were not planned in pre-colonial times. So we really have to start thinking, what is the future of these African cities? And here I want to give us pause and say that this is the future of the world. The future of African cities is a global inflection point because the demographic, economic, and environmental significance of these cities are going to affect the rest of the world. We have youthful populations, and by 2050, we know that most of the working population around the world is going to be African. So we all have to be thinking about what's going to happen to these cities. Are we going to be able to transcend Western urban paradigms, such as the colonial planning systems? And are we able to start learning from the margins, such as learning from informality? Many of our cities are informal, meaning that we have slums, but in those slums, you find so much innovation because people have to make things work. So can we learn from that? Can we learn from indigenous and oral knowledge systems that our grandparents brought to the city? And can we learn from hybrid structures or collective stewardship, pluralism in these cities while making them work for us? If we move on to the next slide, we can think very critically about how we work as a collective. So I want to give just one example from the work that I'm doing with several organizations. And this is work that I'm doing with the Open Cities Lab. We're thinking about a platform known as Mijibora. Mijibora in Swahili means better cities. And there I have said that I dream of better cities. I really want to think about how we start planning with our hearts and not just with our minds. How can we become communities of unbound agents, hybrid practitioners who can create a new tradition of urban ancestorship? As I said, I love living in Nairobi, or if I hadn't said it, let me say it now. I love living in Nairobi, and for me, it's a choice. I've worked all across the continent and also traveled to many other parts of the world. And being able to come back to Nairobi and see myself as a hybrid practitioner and bound agent who's bringing in ideas from the rest of the world and ensuring that we think as part of the planet is very important to my work. Can we transcend national and regional boundaries like nature does? Here I'll give the example of the Nile. The River Nile, one of the longest rivers in the world, serves 11 countries. The Nile doesn't care about these countries. Those boundaries are artificial. In many cases, they are colonial. And yet we hold on to them so dearly, like they mean like their life and death. The choices that are made upstream in the Nile, for example, in Ethiopia right now, are affecting people in Egypt. And there's a lot of controversy and conflict around the Nile. So how can we think as a collective, as the people of the Nile, and not just as the people of these different countries? The Luo people, which is my ethnic group, are called the Luo because we followed the Nile. So we were following the Nile all the way to its source, which is the Lake Victoria, and we live around the Nile. We live around Lake Victoria, but now we are divided into 3 countries, which really separate us from the reality that this Lake Victoria, is the source of life for the Luo people. So I want to bring that thinking into Mijibora, which we are planning to have as a digital and intellectual commons, where storytellers, technologists, and dreamers co-create, exchange, and seed new possibilities. Let me finish off with some questions. As someone who spends a lot of time in rooms where we are discussing African development and planning, I'd like to think that we can change the narrative and start to dream of different kinds of cities. When our descendants walk the streets of Kumasi, Masaka, Lome, or eThekwini, will they tread with reverence, knowing that these are places that we planned and shaped with love? Will they honor them as sacred ground where we, their ancestors, dreamed, struggled, and built futures beyond our own? Or will they grieve the echoes of what never was, the dreams unrooted, the cities their ancestors did not have the courage to build for them? Thank you. Let us all become urban ancestors.
Thank you so much, Amolo. Thank you so much for taking us into a different scheme, into a different way of thinking. Also, the provocation you brought by flipping a saying that has been part of your upbringing, of your realities, into something that is actually opening up a new frame of creating planetary perspectives, of inviting us to be good ancestors. We want to work with this, and it's my real pleasure actually to hand over right away to Salvador Rueda. Salvador, you are the director of the Fundación Ecologia Urbana y Territorial in Barcelona. You have a long track record in being engaged with urban environments, in actually understanding how they are rooted in biological science, in psychology, but also looking at their metabolic flows, looking at energy issues, looking at engineering. So you have been working at this intersection of the biophysical, the human, but also the technological. And it's a real pleasure to actually tap into your knowledge and in your extensive experience how to turn cities into urban ecologies. It's our pleasure to have you. Over to you. We just need to check your audio very briefly right now. I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
I don't
Salvador?
think he can hear you. Can you stop sharing the slides? Then he probably notices.
Salvador? We can't hear you. Maybe you have to take off your audio. He changed his audio setting. Okay, we will try to help Salvador to fix the audio situation. Yes, maybe that's the better way of doing it. We will see if that's possible.
Do you hear me?
Yes, now we hear
Okay.
you.
Okay.
Please, I hand over to you.
Okay.
Welcome.
Perfect, no problem. My interest today is to speaking about cities, The cities, I think, is the main responsible of the current uncertainties, even the climate change. Our organization and functionality is the responsible. If we want to change this, if we want to increase our anticipatory capacity, we need to change the theoretical framework. We need to change the tools for planify the cities, and we need to change the governance. Currently, the state governance behind of the United Nations, I think is not possible to follow this way, because at the end, the uncertainties are increasing day by day. We need something different. Perhaps the cities must be another position, and I think it's very important that the cities take account the new aspects to change the current scenario. For this, the theoretical framework starts with an integrated approach beside the ecology. Academic ecology, the main aspect of the ecology is the ecosystems. An ecosystem is a set of elements related between them. For example, a room, a building, a neighborhood, even a city, because they have this definition. And also we need to define the main important aspect of the ecosystem is the set of restrictions of the behavior of the relationship between the elements. At the end, a city is an ecosystem. At the end, the city allows us to understand this complex system integratedly. Normally, we make some approach of the cities always by silos, partially. It's not possible to change practically anything if we don't have an integrated approach, a holistic approach. For this, we need to define the cities like ecosystems. The ecosystem, at the end, allow us also to define the tools, because the cities are the most complex ecosystems that the human beings are created. The next, please. This approach permits us to define models. The models are the elements that the ecologists introduce, because the reality is very complex, but we need to synthesize this complexity. And for this, in my opinion, the models that we develop must resolve the current challenges, the current uncertainties. It means the intentionality of the models are a very important question. The main model for us, the model that can resolve the majority of the uncertainties, must be compact in morphology, must be complex in organization, efficient in metabolism and with social cohesion. This four axes needs different aspects because at the end, we want to resolve with this model, resolve the current dysfunctions, even the global impacts. This model needs to fill of different principles, urbanism principles, to resolve this kind of dysfunctions. 15 dysfunctions, in my opinion, the main dysfunctions that the cities have in that moment. The next, please. And for this, we need to introduce the ecosystem principles of ecosystemic urbanism. And these principles want to challenge to resolve the different dysfunctions and at the end, at the same time, to refill the axis of the model. The next, please. This is the principles I can explain because this presentation, perhaps the coordinators can send you. The next, please. And at the end, we have the complete model, the four axes, the 15 principles, and also we need to objectivize and evaluate these principles, not only for the diagnostic, even we can project the new urban developments, and we can also analyze and objectivize the different aspects of the principles, and we can recognize what can improve the proposal that we are developing. The next, please. For this, we redact this certification. Is a book of 700 pages with the methodology to calculate these variables, these indicators, to know what is the level of compactness, what is the level of complexity, efficiency, and metabolism, etc. Okay? For this, it's very important to planify the cities, recognizing what is the current scenario, and also with the new planification, how we can improve the scores of these current dysfunctions. Then the next, please. For example, this is a neighborhood, a new neighborhood in the north of Catalonia in Figueres, and we planify this eco neighborhood with these tools. At the end, the scores that we get after the analysis and the proposed, the next, please, is a coincidence practically with the 100% that we want to get. At the end, we make with feedbacks how it's possible to improve all the aspects related with morphology, complexity, metabolism. All the aspects are related and integrated in this model. Finally, we are sure that this kind of tools and solutions can not only develop new fabrics, new parts of the city, even to regenerate the existing ones. For this is, in my opinion, very important, the next please, to arrive at the solutions. How, after this proposed, we can make a transformation related with the morphology, the public space, the biodiversity, all the aspects related with the functionality and the organization of the city, we can change with new principles, ecological principles. For this, it's important to have a new visions for planify the cities. If not, the reality don't change it afterward. We need to remove our approach. We need also, like I say at the beginning, new governance. We need, at the end, the cities like leaders of this change over the world. The cities are the problem, but in the cities, we have the solution. In consequence, we need to work together to establish new organizations related with the cities and the civil society, and not only the states. With the state, it's impossible to change practically anything, because in the United States, sorry, in the United Nations, sorry, the Security Council practically stopped all the initiative to change the world. We need new approach. We need new organization. We need new governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Salvador. And I will share the screen, and maybe Blasius can, at least for the 9 minutes, you can still stay with us, pin us all to stage. And we would like to actually check out with each other, understanding a bit better how these concepts relate. So Leon, bioregions, you see a lot of questions on the board, and I would say maybe you can answer those questions just with the comment function in the board directly. Amolo, also the idea of actually creating a kind of ancestral vision on the one hand, but also, of course, including existing concepts. Here was a remark on ecofeminism and other, let's say, philosophies that were also part of the morning session with Rosie Bradotti and at RMIT University. And then, Salvador, you actually bringing us back, on the one hand, to the modernistic idea of how to measure and implement and have the indicators. On the other hand, I think there's also a bridge in the way that you're saying these ways of organizing and institutionalizing the numbers, the concepts, the indicators are not enough. This is where we actually have to create a new politics. This is where we have to transcend the current institutional setup. And I would love to hear from all the three of you, what are ideas how to do that? I think we have a landscape of what needs to change. Also, what opportunities do we have at hand? All of you are deeply involved in very good work, looking at the urgency and at the shifts that are happening. Where is the space beyond? And para means beyond. So how can we go beyond? Salvador, I hand over to you first, because I know you have to jump out, and then Amolo, Leon.
Okay. I think the boundaries for the ecological problems is a problem, because at the end, in the nature, the boundaries practically doesn't exist. In consequence, we need, I think, a new frameworks. Perhaps the civil society, like I said previously, I think is the key. This event, for example, is an example, but not only, because at the end, the rules are detected for the market, for the politics in different scales. But at the end, the reality is not changed. It's changed, but it's worse.
So let's hand over to Amalo. Your reality, I think, is a different reality than Salvador's. I think also in terms of civil society and civic engagement, maybe united civic engagement, you have seen what is possible, also where there are limitations. If you could go beyond, and if you also look into, let's say, new frames of organizing within, but also beyond different continents, what is your idea of transcending these boundaries?
Thank you. Such an important question. I would start again from Nairobi, and I would say that Nairobi has so much to learn from other cities around the world. So in my previous work, and also in the work that I'm continuing with right now, I've played a pivotal role in mayoral programs where we connect leaders from different cities to come together and learn from each other and to exchange ideas and see themselves as frontliners who have to be creating those legacies of change in their cities, but not just doing it for their cities, knowing that they're doing it also for the continent and for the rest of the world. So in Amali, the African Mayoral Leadership Initiative that I led for 3 years, we saw amazing shifts in mindsets when mayors came together and started to debate and learn from each other and understand that they were all facing this very big challenge of providing for their citizens in very constrained settings. And so when they started to see that, oh, there's a mayor, for example, in Masaka, who has the similar constraints, but is making changes by working closely with communities and starting to harness what is available in the city, then we started to see that friendly competition amongst mayors. So I would say that one way for us to transcend is to see ourselves as Pan-Africans. And I see it a lot also with young people where they don't feel constrained by their boundaries. Like, I'm not just Kenyan, I'm also African. So I really see strong leadership playing a role here, where we have leaders who are creating the pathway for us to leave a legacy of transformation and encouraging young people to join that movement. And I'd repeat that we really need to be planning and caring for our cities with love and the same passion that we would our ancestral lands.
So love and numbers, love and indicators. And I wonder what Leon makes of that. Where's your level of beyond? Where's your possibility to actually organize differently, and also the challenges that you pointed out in terms of financing, in terms of resourcing this work? If we look at civil society, what is our possibility to create something that is resilient, create something that is anti-fragile?
Big questions, hard to answer. I think the first thing I want to say is I don't think we have to wait for this big switch to be switched and then for a new reality to be there. I think what is most important is that across the landscapes we work on what we in Dark Matter Labs call options, but what other might call possibilities or proofs of concept, or building muscles, and all of those kinds of notions I think are important, so that when the windows of opportunity shift, that we are ready. And I think for some of these bi-regional financing topics that you've also now asked me to speak to, we might already be slightly behind. It feels like the moment is right for these things to come to fruition, and I'm not sure we've quite figured out yet how to build these things in the proper way. There are lots of ideas and a lot of people are working on this, but I think we really need to speed up building these options and testing them in different environments, because it might happen faster than we think that these things become relevant. So I guess just very practically, you know, starting small, really starting to evolve some of the things that we know are not fit for purpose, and attaching new functions, underlying new principles, organizing very locally, empowering local decision making and governance in the bioregions is a good step to start, and then radically imagine from there, but build these options is what I would say.
Thank you so much. I think this is a very good, let's say, baseline for actually taking that into planetary civics as an action learning network, and also understanding how we can provide your concepts, match with others, and actually do together. So thank you so much for laying out the groundwork. And it's my pleasure now to actually hand over to a very dear colleague, Tobin Chadlin, and Next Generation Voices, Amolo. We will not only talk about it, but we will try and actually match it with some realities that maybe often aren't at the table. And Tobin, I'm so happy you're here with us today. You're a strategic designer, you're an educator, you have been really ingrained in fostering transdisciplinary collaborations, you have been driving systemic transitions, you always looked at very critical and also crisis environments with a lot of creativity, with a lot of dedication, with a lot of care. You have been a founding member of the Center for Complexity at the Rhode Island School of Design, and you serve currently as the co-director of the Master for Strategic Design at El Lizava School of Design and Engineering in Barcelona. It's such a pleasure to have you and the people you brought with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. That was lovely. And congratulations on the launch of the Planetary Civic Inquiry. This is really exciting, and looking forward to supporting the effort as it evolves and continues. I don't need to introduce myself, but I will be speaking from maybe a couple different hats, and I will be joined by 4 lovely humans who are some of my current students and alumni of the Master of Strategic Design program at El Lizava here in Barcelona, and they will introduce themselves in due time. Maybe to start, given that this initiative is framed around inquiry, we wanted to contribute in that same spirit. So we wanted to share reflections, questions from our work, and ground it in place-based examples. So maybe just to also set some context and say a few words about strategic design, because that term has come up. It's a practice very much oriented in the how. How do we create the conditions for change to occur, whether that's shaping spaces for encounter or for conversation, for building capabilities, or designing, I might even say rehearsing different realities. It's also a practice that traverses between scales, zooming in and zooming out in service of really sort of understanding the whole architecture of the challenges that we're engaging with, and finding ways or identifying ways to intervene across the system. So with that context, we wanted to put on the table for today an offering of perhaps, let's say, 3 framings that we're calling out as conditions for change, that is coming from, again, the learnings that we're contending with and designing in our own work. So the first condition is time. Systemic challenges, they unfold over unpredictable time scales. And many of these, the sort of structures that we work within operate on timelines that are misaligned or don't have the ability to respond to the pace of change. And so one of the questions that we are exploring is, how are we orienting our work within larger timescales? And are we being realistic about our own time commitment in the challenges? So maybe to land this in an example, my colleagues and I at the Center for Complexity at Rhode Island School of Design have been engaged in the ongoing opioid crisis in the US over the past 5 years. And given the stigma and history of extractive relationships and dynamics in the space, part of our even decision to get involved required setting or just sort of acknowledging, like setting a commitment of time to engage with the challenge. And that meant committing time in order to really understand and learn and listen what was going on, showing up in the community to multiple layers of the, across the system, to be present and find ways of embedding ourselves in the local fabric in Rhode Island. And of course, over time, building relationships and trust, is very much needed in order to meaningfully collaborate with many of the folks in the challenge space to steward any sorts of kinds of change. Time also plays a critical role in adapting to a constantly evolving landscape. So the opioid crisis, as it's often referred to, but also like many other challenges, are not static. And in this case, we were working, it was being shaped daily by different sorts of factors, whether it was the COVID crisis or lawsuits playing out nationally against big pharmaceutical companies, et cetera. So this commitment of time enables us to sort of dance alongside these shifts and respond accordingly. And I have to say, this work is obviously part of broader efforts that will take far longer than any of our own involvement in it. And so given that that's likely the case for many of us in our work, I think one of the questions is, how do we ensure that our short-term actions, because we still need to be acting in the now, contribute meaningfully to those longer timeframes? So to speak on this from maybe some of the work that we're engaging here in Barcelona from a different challenge space, I'd like to invite one of my students, Alvaro, to introduce himself and share his experience in question as well.
Thank you, Tovan. Hola, everyone. I'm Alvaro de la D, designer, creative, and passionate about co-designing better future scenarios based in Barcelona. In 2024, the city where I live faced the worst drought in 200 years, and most citizens weren't even aware of it. In our first strategic design master's project, we uncovered multiple systemic challenges. One of the biggest was a short-term mindset toward water, shaped by a mental model of dominance over nature. Shifting such a belief system takes time, yet everything around us runs on speed. Businesses chase the next quarter, startups sell instant success, AI shrinks decisions into milliseconds, and politics moves like a breaking news feed. Meanwhile, real transformation moves at the pace of ecosystems, policies, and cultures, slow, uncertain, and often invisible at first, much like a drought that goes unnoticed until no water comes out of the tap. And just like water, change isn't something we control. It's something we are part of, because water is not ours, water is us. So my question is, how can we work within complex systems when their natural pace clashes with market-driven pressure for instant results? If real change takes decades, how do we get decision makers to commit to futures they might never personally see? Thank you.
Thank you, Alvaro. The next condition that we want to put on the table is proximity. I think when talking about planetary scale, these challenges can feel very overwhelming and even paralyzing. And it's something that we talk about with my students often. And I think when they manifest in specific places, communities with real people, I think someone said earlier, when they show up with a face in our streets, they become a bit more graspable and tangible. And I think in that specificity, we can find some of our agency. As Alvaro mentioned, we've been working here in Catalonia on various dimensions of the drought. So last summer, the region here experienced an emergency state with extreme water restrictions impacting household consumption. Public amenities in the city were turned off or emptied. Many industries had to cut way back. And one of the responses to this, or one of our responses, is that we designed a series of exhibitions around the city to engage with the public. And one of the findings from this was both a real, some lack of awareness around these issues, but at the same time, I think as a result of the crisis or this sort of emergency state, there was a heightened collective awareness of proximity, not in terms of our physical closeness, but in understanding our shared dependence on proximal ecosystems, such as the watersheds and rivers that we rely on. And to Leon's earlier comments about bioregions, people may not necessarily be familiar with that language, but these shared realities do open up, I think, new scales of relating to one another and relating to our environments. And they challenge these rigid mental boundaries that are, lines drawn on a map or silos and jurisdictions. And obviously this was prompted by a dire situation here. So I think one of the questions we're sitting with is how can this shift from survival mode to an everyday consciousness? Last note on this, I guess, is proximity alone does not necessarily mean that we're skilled at working together. But I think it can be a useful condition for, relating and connecting as necessary ingredients for a practice of making together. So to speak to a couple different aspects of this, I'd like to invite my students, Andy and Gigi. Andy first. You might have to unmute yourself.
To spotlight them, what's their name in the chat?
Andrea.
So, hi everyone. My name is Andrea, but you can call me Andy. I've been working with adult education for almost a decade, and I moved to Barcelona to do the master in strategic design. And as Tobin was saying, we've been looking for this problem of the drought in Barcelona and how to work with that and try to bring some interventions to the table. And the first time that I had contact with this project, I was in the town for 3 or 4 weeks, and I have never heard about it. And of course, my first reaction was to look for some serious or proven knowledge about the subject. And then, of course, I want to find data, papers, like reliable data that I could trust and I could think about some interventions. But then this one came like some provocation from Tobin and from the other colleagues that it was like, why don't you start the research or any project that you want to do for that by engaging with the city directly? So this is where proximity comes. This means that I have to get out of my digital research bubble that we are so used to and my way of researching and engaging with projects and go to the streets to observe people, behaviors, relationships. It involves a lot about myself and getting inside of the cities and just looking and observing and try to understand how these relationships could affect me and affect my research to then, after all, come back to this reliable data. So proximity opened my eyes to maybe shift the way I relate to the city, to the people, and the places that I want to intervene.
Thank you. And Gigi.
Okay, hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Gigi. I'm based in Barcelona. And for the last almost 10 years, I've been working on local development, specifically focusing on the job integration of refugees and migrants in the tech sector across Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. As part of my work, I collaborate in a consortium with several other tech schools, all dedicated to supporting refugees. And one of the biggest challenges that I face in being part of this alliance is actually in translating high-level strategies into meaningful local actions. Decisions often come from the top, and yet their success depends on how well they resonate with the communities and how we engage them. So I've learned that co-creation, it happens on multiple layers, but too often the local level is actually expected to implement strategies that were shaped elsewhere. When communities feel disconnected, then engagement drops and impact gets lost. So this is not just a challenge of implementation, the way how I look at it, it's more like a challenge of empowerment. And I guess that if we want systemic change, we must not only rethink how to design strategies, but how we make them truly belong to who is going to bring them to life. So the question I often ask myself is, how do we design processes that allow high-level strategies to be adapted, owned, and shaped by local communities so that they don't just comply with change, but they actually drive it? And thank you. Back to Toban.
Thank you, Gigi. The last third condition we'll offer today is mindset. And there's perhaps a lot to say on this front. It's already been brought up in the panel right before us. So I'll focus on one for the time being. Oftentimes, I think, especially in the design field and design training, we are trained to sort of take a deficit-based approach, focusing or looking for problems or what is broken or what needs to be fixed. And that by sort of default shapes the way that we come to understand a challenge and informs our approach. But part of practicing a critical mindset is also finding ways to remain open, what we might call wide apertures. And this includes embracing a asset-based approach as well. So, looking for what's already working, where is there already existing momentum, what effort needs support or amplification, and what value can we add, if any. This is something I'm constantly reminded of in the work that I've been involved in and working alongside communities. And we've been having similar conversations with here in Catalonia, engaging with different agricultural communities and farmers in the region, bridging both urban and rural contexts, identifying patterns of change, aligning around opportunities that are synergistic, and to maybe put a bit of a plug for the value of design and designers, the ability to, again, make new realities together. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to last student, Karina, to share her reflections and questions as it pertains to mindset.
Hi, my name is Karina, or Cari for short. I'm Latina, Peruvian, strategic designer based in Barcelona. For the last 10 years, I've been working in design projects. And since the very beginning, something that I've been listening a lot is the fundamental principle to put the user at the center. I was told that by developing empathy, and that means truly understanding the users' challenges and their context, that was going to be the foundation of good design, of what good design is actually. But over the past year, something shifted in my practice. During my master, with my master programs, we work on city-scale complex problems. And those kind of problems that couldn't be solved by just understanding one single user need. So that's when I realized something. Curiosity is just as essential as empathy in my design practice. Because curiosity pushed me beyond individual experiences. It helps me question my own biases and beliefs. And also it pushed me to explore overlooked topics, and also pushed me to ask better questions. It shapes my focus from immediate needs to the system shaping them, allowing them to address root causes and not only symptoms, leading to a more deeper and lasting impact. So now when I'm working in a new design project or a new challenge, my approach is not only ask, what does the user need, but also ask, why is this happening? What are the forces at play? What might be missing, and who are we talking to? Because I learned during these last projects that complex challenge, empathy help us connect, but curiosity help us see. So my question is, what mindsets and ways of thinking should be the next generation of practitioners cultivate to effectively navigate and drive change within complex challenges?
Thank you, Kari. Caroline or Blasius, if you want to throw up on the slide those questions, and maybe just to wrap here and end on one note, I think it's, I want to maybe just say something about the role of education. It's come up in today's conversation, it's come up in the earlier events prior to this. And from my experience in education and more, learning environments more broadly, they do play a critical role, or I believe they can play a critical role in supporting, these changes. They definitely serve as early, points of encounter, transformation in shaping our thinking and approaches as future practitioners. They also can serve as spaces for, convening their exploratory, playgrounds for prototyping, small scale experiments that can ripple into the broader ecosystems. And I think especially in design education, we do have an opportunity to engage with these challenges in very hands-on, applied experimental and experiential ways, bridging theory and practice and the local to the planetary. So with that, we offer these perspectives and questions for the panel and to everyone as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much to our lovely Tobin and the next generation voices that brought us their reflections and questions that came out of these projects. Your perspectives reminds us of the planetary thinking is it's not just an intellectual exercise, but it has to do with a lived experience that needs to be grounded in place in relationships and in action. And we now take these questions that we see right now and shift to our Alliance panel, where we will explore how bioregions and their cities can become meaningful actors for planetary commons across different continents, guided by these questions that we just heard. To guide the conversation, I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists. There are three of them. The first is Marta Fernandez, the Executive Director of RMIT Europe, where she leads the university's European engagement, strengthening international partnerships, expanding research impact, and shaping global student experiences. Welcome to the panel. Then we have Indy Johar, mission holder at Dark Matter Labs, professor at MIT, and leading thinker in planetary civics, systems innovation, and regenerative urbanism. And then you already know her, Caroline Pollick-Teal, executive director of Politics for Tomorrow. She's an expert in strategic design and public policy, dedicated to democratizing transformation processes with political, administrative, and civic institutions. Also, I am very happy to introduce Loreen Wong, who is the research director at RMIT Europe and whose work spans designing research strategy, partnerships, and innovation in complex systems. So I'll hand it over to you, Loreen, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Blasius. What an afternoon we've had, and how to move forward with our final part, which is to have, I suppose, to bring a lot of the ideas of the afternoon and the presentations together, particularly from the questions of the next gen designers. But I think that in itself needs to also build on the insights from the presentations that came before them, because it's been this lovely transition often between big scale, micro scale, big scale propositions down to smaller scale interventions, and appropriately for what we're talking about, very place-based, because it's in place that all the action really takes place. So my first question is going to be to Marta, and it's around the first question around time. And in this, the questions too, for those who didn't catch it, as well as being on the screen, they are also in the chat if people are wanting to capture them, is how do we build this relationship and to commit our present efforts to a future that we may not see, to think in the long term whilst acting very much in the immediate, in this kind of space.
Thank you very much, Loreen. And maybe before I go to answer the question, I should say that it's a real pleasure to be here and be part of that, thought leadership group RMIT with Rhode Island Institute and Dark Matter Labs and Politics for Tomorrow. And as Caroline put it, you know, considering what are the planetary implications of everything we do. So to answer your question, Lorraine, I guess one of the things I would say is something picking up on one of the commentary from the previous speakers of intergenerational equity and emphasizing the importance of fairness between generations so that we can be good ancestors. I love that expression. And that way, legacy thinking can become second nature to us, and we can encourage individuals and communities to think about the legacy they want to leave behind and that long-term commitment. Perhaps if you had a chance to be part of this morning session, it was interesting actually to see how art can bring him back to today and can help us reflect on what an extreme anthropocentric future could look like. And maybe I would mention as well that institutions really have a crucial role to play in embedding this long-term thinking into policies and practices, and the institutional support is essential to ensure that the needs of future generations are considered in today decision-making. And the relatively recent UN's Declaration for Future Generations has been a good step forward, but you know, Alvaro has put it very well. How does this translate into having some real political commitment? Because in many cases, these movements remain fragmented, underfunded, and vulnerable to co-option by different individual interests. No? So what I've seen working well at times when at European, you know, at pan-European scale is when there has been some clear future vision with a roadmap that then allows to enable the investment required and the commitment across different stakeholders so that it can be translated into, you know, that future vision can be translated to what can we do today, tomorrow, and in the more recent future. And a roadmap like this with future public investment commitment can then drive private sector engagement so that we can shape these hopeful long-term futures with the intention of replenishing nature. So I think this future vision and aspiration is really required, and that ambition to have a common mission so that we can focus on being proactive rather than reactive. And just to finish up, kind of connecting to one of the expert speakers, I've worked in the past in the space of cities, and I think cities have that beauty of being fractal elements where you can play and enable and make things more visible and real with the view of then scaling up to another, to take into other larger scales.
Thank you. I think that the use of the term hope and in terms of thinking of multi-generational is a nice expansion on what Caroline spoke about at the very beginning of today, of the somewhat tenuous times or the period of political change that we're seeing globally. And so I'm interested, Caroline, do you have something you'd like to add into this idea of hope and time, because they both have an ephemeral kind of quality to them?
Thank you. I think I maybe provoke a little bit the kind of, how shall I say, the sentiment that we all want to feel safe. And I understand that, and I understand that care has to be at the center for ourselves, for our immediate environments, in order to do this work. And based on this notion, I think we need to learn how to hand over the baton. We need to know how to work simultaneously. I think also we need to know how to create fields of power, how to create fields of resources. I think understanding that, all of the, I would say, concepts of the past that only could be there because there were symptoms of an extractive modernity paradigm is something we have to reconsider by understanding time, proximity, mindset. What do we need to let go? What do we want to keep? But also, if I see the chat and things on the board, how do we address, I don't know if we can address all of the violence of the past, but how do we address violence right now? And how do we actually still build powerful infrastructure without baking new violences into it? So I think this is something I'm really sitting with. And also thank you for all of these beautiful questions to Tobin and your students. I think this is really at the core, and we need to come together to look at this and to build interventions and practices around this. But I think there's also a responsibility in people like us who have access to certain decision architectures to transcend and communicate what is necessary on the institutional and on the resource side. And I think with this, I hope, Indy, you can take and build on that. It's really something we all, every single person here in this meeting has to think around, because there's no one actually going to do this work if we are not going to do it.
Exactly. Thank you. So thank you for Indy.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for a great session. Really enjoyed listening. I suppose I'm going to be, I think one of the crisis that we're facing is everything is re-entangling. And people do not know how to deal with the re-entanglement of everything. And that re-entanglement is of you and I as the theory of the individual. We as a human are re-entangling. And this is where we're in the middle of identity wars and separation anxieties. At the same time, the chair is re-entangling, because you realize the chair is the function of the forest. Everything is re-entangling, and it's unwinding all of our tools of holding the world. Property, mine, yours, you, them, all are, and that's just the grammar, but the grammar then makes it visceral in our institutions and our logics. And in that is urban and rural, cities and non-cities. The kind of illusion of the city is just that. It's a sort of line. But the reality is a city is just a metabolic flow and knot of flows. And the house is not the house is a relationship with the forest, if it's a timber house. So in that, the object of the house is the illusion. So somebody that draws you a plan and shows you the house, that is the object illusion. What you have to see is the relationship with the forest. And what you're designing is the relationship with the forest. So when you start to see the world from that lens, and this is why this initiative for me is really important, is you start to re-entangle everything at the planetary scale. The crisis we have at a European level is that we just don't actually have the carbon budgets to do any of the targets that we talk about. We have we can afford to build 144,000 homes a year, as opposed to 1.5, 1.7 million. And we don't have the timber resources to build any of this stuff. So actually what we're going to have to do is systemically regenerate our metabolic flows in order to rebuild those capacities. And this is a challenge to all of our language, all of our framing, all of our design theory, all of our means of organizing at a structural level. And this is why it's not planetary cities, planetary things, planetary civics, everything is re-engaging. And I think in that, we're in the middle of a revolution which rhymes with history. It rhymes with indigenous models of thinking, but at the same time, it is everywhere and is total and planetary. It's not just some people versus other people. Everything is re-entangling. And I think the wars that we experience are the effects of people resisting, and the re-entanglements, those re-entanglements are impositions on people's perceived theories of freedoms. because we haven't found another way of manifest our being. And I think this is the crisis that we're in the middle of. So I think what I just want to say is that I think there's a structural transformation, and it challenges all of our professional orthodoxies. So often what I find is I get into rooms and everyone goes, let's re-entangle down from what I can see, right? It's a sort of, I can see the city, so let's re-entangle the city. I can see the house, so I re-entangle the house. It's always proximate downwards because that's comfortable. But when you have to proximate yourself outwards, when you say, I can no longer draw that master plan because it's a relationship with the forest, that's a crisis. And I think this is a psychological dichotomy that we are sitting in, is this re-entanglement is everywhere and to every part. And I think that requires us to shift taxonomy, logics, financing mechanisms, and everything else. But I would also say, just to close, I think this is kind of quasi-inevitable. The re-entanglement is now inevitable. And it's visible in everything else. It's visible now in our pricing systems. Our economic systems are now starting to have to reprice all those externalities back onto the books. So this is now an inevitable engine. The kind of planet is re-entangling at every level. And that, I think, is quite extraordinary and quite beautiful if you look at it that way.
Thank you. I think that's a very, it's very interesting, obviously, but I think as a framing, or could be a provocation, but if we were to think of it as a framing of to do this disentanglement, and as you've raised just then, it's not one, and I come from a design perspective, that's I'm a professor of design, and I could say, well, design's the answer, but it's definitely not. It's one, it's part of, and this disentanglement, as you're putting it, I think, along with, because we've heard words disentanglement now, fragility, proximity, our affective relationships between the human and non, the porousness or the continuum of the human, our base point, to everything else that is the world around us, natural and not. I think that they're the very interesting things that can both cause anxiety and also possibility, depending on how we choose to, as you're suggesting, as indeed to be in that. And so, and I think that that's where the questions from that have been framed by the students are actually quite excellent and profound in helping us to think through these core components about how and where we are in time and relations, proximities, and then our mindsets. Who do we have to, how do we come to this work? Some would say, what is our posture in this work as well, from a transition design perspective, whether we're looking close or we're looking at the landscape or we're looking at the heavens. How are we thinking about that? So with that, I'm interested then, Marta, to come back, because I know that your work also expands into a lot of agencies that are exploring how this might happen, from both within the UK and across Europe. And so this complexity of going beyond the boundaries of policies as they exist, and our ambitions of policies, or ambitions of with policies are actually things that enable or meant to catalyze activity or measure it. I was wondering if you have any observations to this from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, because you're referring to what we were discussing with proximity and the decentralization that kind of needs to happen to be able to shift power and resources from central authorities to local communities and so on. And I mean, capacity building is critical for that, and providing this education, training, resources to local communities so that they can have the ability to engage and shape high-level strategies. And from RMIT Europe, we've been working on how can we support this leadership approach in the public sector so that it can be influencing policy and people feel better equipped to drive the change that is needed. And looking at, you know, that sustainability and social change work. So this is, we're in the developing education and training, which are, as a university, areas where we can mobilize kind of action and make an influence. And And then maybe the other thing I would refer to is so critical to bring that cooperation between industry, universities, public sector, citizens, and nature, and that quintuple helix, or however it gets to whichever degree, to drive innovation. So that's one of the things I would flag. And something else that I would highlight, if we think about this issue of how to empower local communities, is to how we can learn from the multiple pilot project Living Lab. Something was mentioned earlier with one of the expert speakers. You know, there are initiatives like in Africa, these small scale experimental projects that can give these valuable insights. How can we then scale that up so that we can identify those innovative solutions that we can nurture and support, and that can be, you know, translated across different contexts. So in that, building networks and alliances, collaboration with regions, by regions, institutions, cities, you know, it's a key way to amplify efforts and create these supportive ecosystems that will enable sustainable development.
Thanks. Caroline, do you have anything to add to that?
I have so much to add to that, but
Well, you don't have that long. I'm going to tell you, you've got
I
4
also have a
minutes.
view on the time. So I think also watching the chat a little bit, I think Planetary Civics is dedicated to look at the language, to look at the translation, to look at what kind of educational approaches do we actually need to train ourselves, but also to lay out a path for the generations that are coming after us. I think also for me, I'm part of the Smart City team here in Berlin. I'm part of the sustainability strategy. I think even terms like innovation, sustainability, smart city, scaling, all of these terms, they're like at the moment becoming a new materiality because they are rooted in a thinking of the past that was absolutely crucial. Also, I don't want to take away innovation from the public sector because it took such a long time for people to actually embrace it and be part of a movement. But I think deep down in us, we have to understand there is a new language, there is a new paradigm, there is a new practice, and the kind of modernist anthropocenic ways of approaching transformation or transition has come to a limitation that we can transcend, but it needs all of us to be extremely honest to each other and also willing to let go.
And that's one of the true challenges, I think, the letting go. Did you have anything you would like to say in our last or add?
Yeah, I think it's just that I think as we enter this crisis, we're often fall back to what I would say 19th century versions of hope, cooperatives. We fall back to ideas of responses of how the 19th century industrial world was trying to build hope. And labor unions, the conversation, theory of labor unions. So we've got, and I think we have to embrace the fact that we're living in a different reality. And the challenge that we're operating in is no longer about bounded, but it's about unbounded means of organizing in unbounded commons. So everyone, I was at Yale and somebody was saying to me, oh, Elinor Ostrom. I was like, Elinor Ostrom was great, but she could only deal with bounded commons theory. And our problem is unbounded commons theory. And I think we are living in a paradigm shift of operating in the theory of unbounded commons, whether it's the house as an unbounded commons in space and time, whether it's the chair, whether it's your spoon. And I think one of my biggest requests would be, let's release ourselves from the illusionary hope of a 19th century solution. And I was being slightly provocative in the chat where I was like, I don't know what is local anymore. I know something's approximate, but I don't know what is local. And I think these are, and again, I'm not in any way critiquing it. I'm just trying to, I don't know what the language is, right? So I don't have a solution. I just am trying to open up the landscape that maybe the local and the far is an illusion, as well as the urban and the rural is an illusion of the 19th century. These dichotomous languages aren't relational languages. They're not verbing languages. They are separationist languages. And this is a way of seeing the world to which we require a different way of organizing. And I think that changes financial models. I think we will not be owning things. We will be in the stewardship of materials. I think we'll finance things differently. I think our material economy will be radically different. I think everything changes when we move into this worldview. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I think that that's an excellent summation for where I think we are and what we need. And the next steps of how we start to actually go into that space, and for those of us who are educators to even embrace that, is a very interesting and needed phenomenon. So with that, I will bring this to a close, this session, and thank you. And I can't remember who I have to hand over to, but someone will jump in.
Thank you so much, Laureen. Thank you so much, Marta and Indy. Blasius, you are back, and the last 2 hours have been actually passing by so quickly.
Yes. So thank you to all the speakers again. I'll unspotlight you. And the last thing that we have prepared for you is to take a breather after all of what we've just heard and what went through our brains and through our bodies. I want you to invite you to take a moment of stillness and reflection and to connect to the planetary. Now we've heard what is the local anymore, but we do know we have a body that's here. We can take a deep breath. And with every breath we take in, also atoms, molecules of the planetary, of the whole Earth. And yeah, let's take one moment to connect with that in silence. Yeah, thank you very much. And as a checkout for all of you, when you're ready, take some time to take some notes. We prepared some questions and another little interaction page. You can inspire each other, answer these questions, give us some feedback. And we're very happy to end this on a reflective note.
Thank you so much, Blasius. Somebody already wrote it in the chat. Times are urgent. Let's slow down. There has to be time for connecting. There has to be time for urgency, but also not only needs, also assets, as we learned from Tobin. What are our assets? What are our possibility spaces for gentle action, for something that is inviting us to rethink the paradigms where we're coming from, but also consciously choose what lays ahead of us and how we want to engage and re-entangle with it. And we have an offer for you. Connect with our LinkedIn group. Also, the link will be shared in the chat and afterwards. And we, as Planetary Civics Inquiry, as the initiators, we are committed to learning together in an action network over the next 10 times 100 days. We invite you to be part of that learning journey. Here are the first dates. You will receive the registration link in after mail with all of the videos and all of the chats that we produced today. Thank you so much for being with us. And this is not the last event of today. There is another event coming up in just 1 hour with our dear colleague Katie Edmonds, who has been part of the Center for Complexity crew, and she is inviting you to embody the planetary, to be human in an age of entanglement. Come back to us if you can, and have this very special checkout session with us in just 1 hour. It is starting. Thank you for being with us here today.